In this tutorial, we're going to start off by creating a simple on-off switch activated by pressing a key. We're then going to create a HUD or an overlay display. Then we'll create a door for our house that automatically opens when we approach it. And then we'll use logic to only display our HUD when we are inside the house. We'll start by using a switch to change the lighting in our scene, focusing first on creating a simple on-off switch. So if we go to the channel list and then go to an value operator, you can see we have a list of different operators here. Now all of these have different functions that result in a value. So what we want to look at here is to have a flip-flop triggered value. So basically what that will do is it will give us a value that flip-flops between 0 and 1 when it gets an input. So we've now got this here. Let's now get a user input channel and drag that in. If we double click this, you see we have a dialog, and this dialog allows us to select all sorts of things to do with the input. So for the moment, let's choose a user keyboard information, and then if we click this button here, which is capture a key to use, you can then press any key and that key will be used for the input. So let's press space here, and you can see here we can define that if the button is pressed, it gives a value of 1. If it's not pressed, it gives a value of 0. So let's connect this up to the toggle and then connect the toggle up to our start channel. Now you can see if I put it in run mode, whenever I press space, you can see our user input is always going on off depending on whether space is pressed or not, and our toggle, every time it receives an input trigger, goes from 1 to 0. We'll now look at how you can switch between two channels. So let's put this to use now and go to our environment channel group and use this to swap between two different light map textures. So what I'm going to do is just hit Ctrl X and cut this from this CGR, go over to our group tree and go into our environment channel group, and I'm going to hit Ctrl V and paste it in here. So you see we now have our piece of logic here. Now the next thing we want to do is create a second texture. So what I can do here is just hit Ctrl C and copy this one, paste it over here, double click it and load in a new texture. So let's load in a texture here. So you see we now have a different light map. One is for when the house has its lights turned on, and the other one for when its lights are turned off. So let's rename our textures so they represent that. So this one is going to be lights on, and this one lights off. Okay. So what we now need to do is create some kind of logic that will switch between our two light map textures here. So we need another channel now. So let's go back to the channel list and select a channel switch. So get a channel switch and drag it in there. And now basically a channel switch will work by switching between channels of the same type. So their base type must be the same. So we have no problems here because we have two channels with base type texture. And what we must do here is actually set the base type of our channel switch to the channels we are switching between. So we're switching between textures, so we set our channel switch to texture. Now what that basically does is it will change the base type of our channel switch to texture, which means we can connect this channel switch up to anywhere that a texture should connect to. So what I'm going to do now is replace all of the links to our light map with our channel switch, and then we can connect the light maps up to our channel switch, its children. Now the way a channel switch works is that it has an input value which is on the first child link position, and that input value will select which of its following children will be called. So for instance, if our input value is 0, our first child will be called. In this case it's our light map house on. If the input value is 1, then the second child will be called, which is our light map with the lights off. And if the input value was 2, it would call the next one. If it was 3, the next one, and so on. So you can link loads and loads of children up to a channel switch, and the input value will decide which of these children is to be called. So let's select this up here. We've connected it up, and let's now move our camera into the house, which we've done there. Put it in run mode, and you can see now our light map is being changed when we press the space. When we press the space, the channel switch is changing which texture is going to be used for our house, and so that gives us a very different lighting situation. Let's now change the key that's used to change the light map, because at the moment that's sharing the same key that's being used to reset the camera. So if we press L on the capture key here, we're now using the L key to change the light map, and the space will reset the camera. So now we're looking for our walkthrough camera. We can inspect this more closely. So you can see we can now use the L key to change our light map, and whenever we press spacebar, this piece of logic in our start group here will reset our current position to the position which is specified here. Let's now focus on creating a HUD or head-up display for our scene. We'll start by creating its camera. So if we're in our start group, and what we want to do first of all is create a second renderer. So if we go to channel list and get a 3D render, let's drag that into this scene, connect it up. We also want a camera, so I'm just going to go back to the templates and get a basic camera from the templates and connect it up. Let's pack it away in a folder. And we also want to get a primitive object just to show how it works to start with. So if we get a primitive object and connect that up to the renderer, now we're pretty much ready to go. So what we first have to do is go to our perspective view and have a look at where these cameras are and where the object is. So you can see our second camera. Let's first of all name it something. I'm going to call this HUD camera, for head-up display camera, and let's move the primitive object back a little bit like that. Now you can see already this is working. What's happening is wherever we move our camera, you can see that our primitive object is always being rendered on top and is static irrespective of where we ever look in our walkthrough camera. Now the reason for that is that it's being rendered after our walkthrough camera. It's basically like rendering it to a separate layer. Like if you can imagine, you've got a first layer which is moving around, which would be our first walkthrough camera. We're then rendering another static layer on top of that using a static camera and just a primitive object. So it's basically entirely separate from what's going on here. We first render our entire scene through our walkthrough camera, then on top of that we're rendering using a static camera just our primitive object. So you can see this is now working, but if we want this to be a display, we don't want to risk it being rendered behind other objects. So what we want to do is disable the Z buffer, and what this will do is it will force it to be rendered on top of everything else, so it will actually behave like a display. So we have to do that in the object section. So let's go to the object section and let's look in our start group, select the primitive object, go to surface, and then you can see here what we've got to do is uncheck Z write and Z read, and then you can see wherever we look our square object is always being rendered on top. We'll now add some 2D text to our HUD. So let's now replace our primitive object with some text. So let's go to the channel section again and